On the morning of June 30th, 1956, 2 passenger flights departed Los Angeles bound for the Midwest. Neither plane, however, would reach its destination. Instead, both would end up in the Grand Canyon, having been involved in the first commercial aviation accident to cost more than 100 people their lives. It was an accident that would change the aviation industry forever. Trans World Airlines Flight 2, a Lockheed Super Constellation carrying 70 passengers and crew, took off from Los Angeles, bound for Kansas City. At the same time, United Airlines Flight 718, a Douglas DC-7 with 58 on board, departed for Chicago. Their paths would lead them over Grand Canyon National Park. In 1956, aircraft didn't communicate directly with air traffic control while flying, but through a company radio dispatcher who would instead relay the messages. Controllers from different airlines would sometimes share relevant information with one another, but were not required to do so by law. Shortly after takeoff, the captain of TWA Flight 2 requested permission to ascend to 21,000 feet in order to avoid a bank of cloud. His request was denied, as the United Airlines flight was nearby and already at that altitude. He still wanted to avoid the clouds ahead, and so he requested permission to go 1,000 on top, meaning that he would take the plane up until it was at least 1,000 feet above any cloud and switch to visual flight rules. Air traffic control approved this request, without knowing that on that morning, clouds over the Grand Canyon were at 20,000 feet. This clearance allowed the TWA flight to fly at the same altitude previously denied, placing it at the same altitude as United Airlines Flight 718, putting them on a collision course. At around 10:30 a.m., as the 2 flights were maneuvering around cloud at the same altitude, they collided. The tail of the TWA Super Constellation was severed in the crash, sending it into a rapid nosedive. It slammed into a ravine on the northeast slope of Temple Butte in the Grand Canyon and disintegrated, killing everyone on board. A fire swiftly consumed the wreckage. Meanwhile, the United Airlines Douglas DC-7 suffered severe damage to one wing and one engine. It impacted the south face of Tois Butte at high speed, resulting in the instant death of everyone on board. In the absence of radar, it was not immediately apparent to air traffic controllers what had happened to the 2 aircraft. In fact, it was not until 11:51 a.m., over an hour after the collision, that a notice was issued advising that the planes were missing, and asking all pilots in the area to report anything unusual. 2 pilots from Grand Canyon Airlines, a sightseeing air tour service, did. They reported seeing a plume of black smoke near Temple Butte earlier in the day, but had assumed it was merely a small brush fire. Now aware that 2 commercial airliners were missing, the 2 pilots took a second look and soon spotted the distinctive 3-pronged tail of the TWA flight in a ravine, as well as the wreckage of the United Airlines flight. Once the location of the crash sites was determined, rescuers were dispatched by helicopter. They were able to access the remains of the TWA flight and quickly concluded that there were no survivors. Reaching the remains of the United Airlines flight was considerably more difficult. Although a helicopter did manage to land on the nearby ledge in order to confirm that there were no survivors, the operation was extremely dangerous, and authorities did not allow the helicopter to return. Instead, they called in a specially trained Swiss mountain rescue team to climb to the site. They found a scene of utter devastation. A significant amount of wreckage and human remains had become lodged in a vertical crack running up the cliff face below the impact site, a crevice so inaccessible that most of it is still there to this day. Determining the cause of the crash was an extremely difficult process. At the time, cockpit voice recorders and flight data recorders were not used. It was only by examining the damage to the wreckage that investigators could piece together the sequence of events. Paint from each aircraft was found on the wreckage of the other. This, combined with an examination of recorded communications from the pilots, allowed investigators to assemble a chain of events. Both flights had deviated from their planned courses, most likely to offer passengers a view of the Grand Canyon. The TWA flight had been cleared to ascend under visual flight rules to the same altitude as the United Airlines flight. When the planes came within sight of one another through that cloud, it was too late to react, and a catastrophic collision had been the result. News of the accident, including its cause, was broadcast around the world. The American public reacted with shock to the findings of the investigation. The way in which air traffic control was carried out was criticized as primitive and chaotic. Significant changes were demanded by public that, having started to enjoy the benefits of air travel, wanted to know that it was safe. As a direct result of the crash, air traffic controllers across the country were retrained and many new controllers were hired. Radar, previously an exclusive tool of the military, was implemented. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, was formed, a centralized organization responsible for the control of all air traffic in the United States. Since its formation, collisions between planes in flight have become increasingly rare. Though some attempt was made to remove human remains and wreckage from the crash sites by helicopter, it was so difficult and dangerous that it was left incomplete for many years. From 1956 until 1976, wreckage and human remains were abandoned at the two crash sites, prompting a small number of curious sightseers to hike out in order to visit those areas. At the insistence of National Park Service officials, in 1976, the airlines paid for the removal of the majority of the remaining debris. Any small items that remained became officially protected by the Federal Antiquities Act in 2006, before the whole area was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2014. A plaque close to the site informs visitors of its significance. It reads, "This tragic accident site represents a watershed moment in the modernization of America's airways."